General Hospital spoilers reveal that Jason receives a call from Michael on a gloomy night. While sitting alone in a quiet room where only the ticking of the clock and the weight of unanswered thoughts remain. That call wasn't just the transmission of information, it was a mental earthquake. A chain reaction shattering everything Jason thought he understood. Michael's voice over the phone wasn't just the voice of a son trying to explain, it was the voice of awakening. Of a buried truth now screaming to be revealed. Michael, speaking in broken sentences laced with suppressed anger, confessed that he had no idea Willow had been at the clinic in Germany. If he had known, if just one word had reached him, he would have rushed to her without hesitation. That revelation instantly shattered all of Jason's earlier assumptions. His belief that Michael had truly rejected Willow, and his perception that Michael was acting cold and indifferent. Jason sat frozen for a few seconds after the call ended, but inside. His thoughts were spinning wildly and uncontrollably. Michael's call wasn't just an explanation, it was a turning point. A veiled warning that everything Jason had been basing his actions on was being manipulated by another force. And in that moment, Jason felt a cold chill down his spine, a sensation he was all too familiar with, the gut feeling telling him he was being led into a deceptive maze. The first adjustment Jason had to make was to cast aside old beliefs and start questioning the very assumptions he had once held as truths. Because clearly, if Michael didn't know Willow was in Germany, then the woman at the reception desk had lied, and if she lied, someone had made her do it. And one name immediately surfaced in Jason's mind, Drew Kane. Drew, once an ally, someone Jason had once tried to protect, now became the prime suspect in Jason's mind. Drew was the only person who truly knew Willow's plan. Someone with a strong enough motive to prevent the meeting from happening, and most importantly, someone smart enough, and bold enough, to think he could hide the truth from Jason forever. Jason could no longer stay on the sidelines. He knew that if he didn't act now, everything would sink deeper into the shadows of deception and manipulation. Michael's call reawakened an old instinct in Jason, one he thought he had buried, the instinct of a man who once hunted truths in the darkest situations. The instincts of a warrior who wouldn't tolerate lies within his sphere of influence. Jason's chaos wasn't born out of surprise, but out of anger. Anger that someone had taken advantage of Willow's trust, that a peaceful reunion had been shattered by a dirty game. And that he himself, the one who suggested the trip, had failed to anticipate the betrayal hiding in the shadows. And as that anger merged with Jason's sharp intuition, a silent storm began forming in his mind, a plan to answer the questions that had long gone unanswered, a journey to seek justice that, this time, no one could stop. Jason began combing through every detail, every sign, no matter how small. Who knew about the plan? Who was there at the time? Who had something to gain from Michael and Willow not meeting? And soon, all roads pointed in one direction, Drew Kane. Jason no longer had any doubts. Michael's call didn't just confirm that something unusual had happened. It was the first piece in a chain of evidence slowly taking shape, a chain revealing that everything Jason had thought was true might have only been an illusion. And when truth is distorted to serve dark intentions, the craziest part isn't what Drew did, it's how easily the world around Jason had been manipulated like a chessboard. Where pawns like Willow were victims of far more powerful players. And that very night, sitting alone with the phone still in hand, staring into the void while his mind raced through a violent storm. Jason knew, this was the moment everything had to change. This was the time he had to enter the game, not to protect someone, but to tear down the masks hiding the truth. And in his mind, one thing became clearer than ever, Michael's call wasn't just information. It was the signal of a new beginning. A chaotic, maddening, but necessary beginning to expose what had been hidden for too long. Jason no longer had doubts, he was in a new battle, where the enemy didn't come from outside, but was hiding among those he once called friends. Michael didn't stop at just the call to clarify the truth for Jason, he brought back solid evidence. Undeniable proof that Drew was hiding something far more serious than what appeared on the surface. Carefully gathered documents, audio recordings, and insider information from the German clinic were all placed by Michael in front of Jason, making the air in the room feel thick with the weight of truth. What unfolded before Jason wasn't just an attempt to sabotage a meeting. It was a deliberate, organized sequence of actions, executed by Drew, once considered a symbol of integrity. That immediately forced Jason to recalibrate his entire perspective on everything happening around him. His trust in Drew began to collapse, replaced by a growing urgency, a recognition that they were facing a much bigger issue, a darkness expanding and swallowing what once felt familiar and orderly. This revelation opened a new, troubled chapter. As the truth came to light, old connections between people began to unravel. Drew could no longer separate himself from the consequences. And Jason could no longer stand by knowing his old friend was now driven by motives dark enough to betray those he once loved. All signs pointed to Drew following a path out of control, a psychologically unstable route that could, with time, lead to increasingly reckless and dangerous decisions. Jason began to feel a familiar sensation rising, the same instinct he had when tracking enemies in his darkest missions, only this time, the enemy might be someone who once stood beside him. The obsession began to spread, not only in Jason's mind but in Michael's actions as well. The two of them, coming from different angles but united by the same goal, started reviewing every move Drew had made in recent times. And the deeper they dug, the more they realized, Drew's transformation wasn't temporary. It was the sign of an irreversible slide. New shocks kept surfacing. Layers of lies were stripped away. Pieces of memory were being placed back in their rightful context. Drew wasn't just sabotaging a meeting, he was attempting to manipulate the entire course of a family's story with cold, calculated acts. Michael, who had always tried to remain neutral amidst the family's tangled relationships, could no longer stay silent. His outrage stemmed not only from personal hurt, but from the realization that if this continued, Willow, the woman he once deeply loved, would continue to suffer, and their children would grow up in a world of lies. Jason, once the silent observer, now had to act. He couldn't let someone like Drew continue steering everything his way. With the evidence in hand, with a heart driven by betrayal and the pursuit of justice, Jason prepared for the inevitable confrontation, one where all the changes, all the psychological spirals, would erupt into a battle to reclaim the truth. The biggest shock wasn't in what Drew had done, but why he chose to do it. Jason knew something deeper, darker, was pushing Drew, a hidden secret. An unspoken cause that could upend their entire world once more. And when the final truths are brought into the light, will those involved still recognize each other? Or will this shock be the starting point of an irreversible unraveling of what once was a family? After obtaining undeniable evidence exposing Drew's deception, Michael quietly initiated a new plan, a strategic move designed not only to realign a spiraling sequence of events, but also to bring the truth into the light through logic and control, both of which he was gradually reclaiming. In Michael's mind now, there was no longer mere suspicion or anger. There was a deep, consuming obsession, an obsession that if he didn't act himself, everything left of family, of trust, of kindness, would be crushed under the wheels of betrayal. That urgency drove Michael into a far more dangerous game than he had anticipated, a game where the line between justice and revenge became increasingly blurred. His plan wasn't just to expose Drew. It was a calculated effort to recalibrate every link in a chain of events that had been distorted by the hands of a manipulator. But the deeper he went, the wider the scope became. And the more Michael realized he was being pulled into a mental maze Drew had carefully constructed, a space where everything was premeditated, where every reaction was anticipated, and where what appeared real was merely a mask. Michael no longer felt like the orchestrator of the plan, he was becoming a pawn, manipulated by the very obsessions that had initially propelled him. And that obsession was growing, becoming more severe, because it wasn't just about what Drew had done, it was about the fear of what Drew might still do if not stopped in time. As Michael waged this internal battle, an inevitable collision between Jason and Drew was taking shape. They were no longer simply two men with different viewpoints. Now, they were opposing forces, pushed to the edge of implosion. Jason, with the instincts of a warrior who had always put truth first, sensed danger closing in, not just for Willow, but for himself and those around him. Drew, by contrast, was sliding down a slope of increasingly tangled calculations, driven by a darkness in his mind even he could no longer control. Michael, with his clarity clouded by anxiety, knew any misstep now could ignite a full-blown conflict between Jason and Drew, a clash whose consequences would go far beyond personal wounds, threatening to collapse every structure of trust they had ever built. He understood that the adjustment he was trying to make, from revealing the truth, to controlling information, to preventing a fraternal war, was no longer just a moral responsibility, but a race against time. Every passing minute intensified his obsession. And the helplessness of watching two men who once fought side by side now stand on opposite battle lines only deepened his resolve. Yet those very adjustments, his strategies, his careful yet decisive steps, became a double-edged sword. The more he tried to control, the more he sank into a mire where emotion and logic blurred. He was witnessing truth rise to the surface, but he was also seeing fractures in himself, the cracks of a son, a brother, a man who once believed that if he stayed rational, he could save everyone. But what Michael was slowly realizing was this: sometimes, adjustment can't fix a machine that's already broken. And among those broken things might be the brotherhood between Jason and Drew, something that no amount of effort could fully restore. So when the final explosion came, when Jason faced Drew, no longer with the eyes of a brother but with the gaze of a man hunting for truth, Michael could only stand by, consumed by the growing obsession within him. He knew he had done all he could. But sometimes, truth can't save those too far gone into the dark. And that was the greatest shock, not what Drew had done, but the fact that Michael's best efforts, despite all the logic and clarity, still weren't enough to save a collapsing relationship before his very eyes. Jason had always understood Michael more deeply than anyone, not just because of blood or shared history, but because of the psychological bond built through years of facing loss, betrayal, and silent wars within the Corinthos family. Jason had never needed Michael to explain much to know what he was feeling, and Michael had always trusted that if there was anyone who could stay rational amid a storm, it would be Jason. But this time was different. The world Jason thought he knew was unraveling, and the biggest adjustment in his perception came not from the outside, but from within, from the heart, where a new obsession was erupting, no longer suppressible. The story Jason now faced was no longer a battle between right and wrong, but between the survival of what he believed in and the collapse of a man he once called brother, Drew Kane. Drew's actions had moved beyond strategy or defense. They had evolved into a series of manipulations, betrayals, and violations of the sacred things Jason held most dear: family, trust, and his vow to protect Michael and Willow. Jason could no longer stay on the sidelines, could no longer convince himself that Drew was simply making mistakes. Drew's recent behavior was no longer the product of pressure, it was the symptom of a soul rotting from within, a man so consumed by his own obsessions that he would destroy anything to retain control. And within that spiral, Jason felt something he'd never experienced in his past confrontations: the obsession with having to end it himself. There was no other choice now. Every move Drew made placed Michael in deeper emotional danger, not physical, but the kind that shattered trust and made survival in a collapsing world near impossible. Jason, who had once chosen silence over action to preserve peace, could no longer restrain himself. One of the clearest adjustments in his mind was this transformation, from protector to destroyer. And in this case, destruction didn't simply mean removing Drew from influence, it meant tearing down the entire structure of deception he had built. Jason's obsession now wasn't just the urgent need to expose the truth. It was the crushing awareness that he was destined to be the one to end Drew. Not out of hatred, but because there was no other way to protect Michael, Willow, and everyone being dragged into this vortex. Jason knew that as long as Drew remained in control, his dark calculations would only multiply, and the chaos would never stop. And so, when he looked into Michael's wounded eyes, Jason needed no further prompting. He had made his decision, a decision from which there was no turning back. This was no longer a simple confrontation. It was the collision of two fates, one clinging to truth as a last weapon, the other spiraling into corruption. Jason's obsession had become his fuel, the fire driving him to act with precision, coldness, and unprecedented resolve. He didn't just want to unmask Drew, he needed to erase his influence, as if cleansing a stain that had seeped into the moral structure he once held sacred. And in that final moment, as Jason looked back on the path that had brought him here, he knew, every shock, every adjustment, every obsession had led to this. Not for revenge, but to protect what was left. And if that meant he had to be the one to end Drew, then he would not hesitate. Because the greatest madness wasn't Drew's betrayal, it was the fact that he had once been trusted, once been loved. And that made his betrayal the deepest wound Jason had ever received, a wound only decisive action could heal. Drew's end was confirmed, an ending devoid of drama, without a chance for justification. And with no words left to redeem anything. But ironically, when that end came, it didn't close the tangled chapter Drew left behind. On the contrary, it unleashed an aftershock, a long, aching chain of consequences, because Drew's true legacy was never in his promises or the moral mask he wore, but in the hidden calculations. In the schemes twisted by obsession and the hunger for control. Jason thought Drew's fall would be the final chapter, but he was wrong. The truth was, Drew's shadow remained immense. Still clinging to the minds of those who had crossed paths with him, a constant reminder that some people, even after they've fallen, continue to reverberate in every decision that follows. The ruins of what Drew had once manipulated were beginning to surface, confidential files, encrypted conversations, untraceable financial transfers, all coming to light. Pulling the story into a deeper layer, where Drew's legacy was no longer one of power or prestige, but of chaos, suspicion, and psychological scars. One of the greatest adjustments the survivors had to make was accepting the harsh truth. They had once placed their trust in a man who wasn't merely deceitful, but who had actively engineered layers of deception to bend reality for his own gain. And as Jason, who once fought side by side with Drew, began to understand just how far-reaching that influence still was, a new obsession took root. How much of the past had been real, and how much of the present was still being manipulated by that lingering ghost. The change began to spread, like an unstoppable chain reaction. Former allies of Drew began to withdraw or defend themselves. Victims returned, now seeking justice. Events once buried, once distorted by clever hands, began to rise, like drowning memories fighting to breathe again. Michael, who once believed that exposing the truth would be enough, now realized that truth was only the surface. The true danger wasn't what Drew had done, it was what he had set in motion, the currents of psychological and emotional manipulation he'd planted in many people, across many places. And which were now silently running even in his absence. And Jason couldn't escape that spiral either. He had been a symbol of clarity, of action in the name of what was right. But in destroying Drew, Jason had opened a new door, a labyrinth of consequences, where every step now bore the imprint of obsession. Because the reality was this. Killing a man does not erase what he planted. Jason now faced a new kind of pressure, where every time he looked into the eyes of Michael or Willow, he saw the same question echoing silently. What else is still hidden? And in that question, another obsession began to grow. The fear that Jason could no longer trust anything, not even himself, as long as secrets remained unexposed. One of the greatest shifts now unfolding was the silent collapse of long-held values. Concepts once considered absolute, honor, brotherhood, loyalty, were now being cast under the unforgiving light of doubt. Drew had shattered them not through violence, but through cold, calculated, and deeply destructive manipulation. And that was his true legacy, not greatness, but ruin. Not applause, but the stifled sighs of those who survived him. And if Jason hoped to find balance again, if he wanted to restore faith, he couldn't stop at merely ending Drew physically. He had to face the full structure that Drew had thrown off course. He had to rebuild not just order, but trust in the very nature of people. But to do that, Jason would have to overcome something greater than Drew, the mounting obsession within himself, the fear that he might never be the one to end what Drew had started. But only another person caught in the loop of a legacy with no end. Because death was not the end. It was only the beginning of a greater storm, a storm where truth, lies, and unnamed fears began to rise to power. And in that moment, Jason understood, he was no longer fighting Drew. He was fighting the legacy of a man who had embedded his obsessions into the lives of everyone around him. And the most painful truth was this, that legacy was still alive.